This story begins with Laurel, a career woman who just got home after a long day at work. When she arrived, Laurel was surprised by her husband James and their two kids, Josh and Daniela. Turns out they were celebrating Laurel and James's wedding anniversary. Unfortunately, since Laurel came home late, the surprise didn't go as planned. Instead of being happy, Laurel ended up feeling annoyed. Aside from her heavy workload, Laurel wasn't really a fan of surprises like this. She would have preferred if James and the kids had told her in advance so they could plan something together. Once in their room, Laurel's annoyance still hadn't faded. She even brought up James's affair from 2 years ago. Laurel made it clear that James shouldn't do anything without telling her first. But for Laurel, this wasn't just about the surprise. It was more about trust and communication between them. The next day, Laurel vented to her sister Angela about last night's argument with James. Angela asked if Laurel was still questioning the future of their relationship if she couldn't fully trust James. After all, they had agreed to forgive each other after going through marriage counseling. Laurel tried to convince Angela that she could trust James, but still, her lingering frustration remained. Before heading to work, Laurel got annoyed with James again. This time, James suggested a weekend getaway for just the two of them to Chalet Mountains, but they had already promised Josh and Daniela a family trip to Disneyland. James argued that the family vacation could be postponed and that they needed time to rekindle their relationship. But Laurel disagreed. To her, breaking a promise to the kids wasn't something to take lightly. Laurel then told James that she had to attend a seminar out of town today and wouldn't be able to come home until tomorrow. James was annoyed because Laurel only told him now, but Laurel defended herself, saying she had written a memo on the calendar on her desk. For context, Laurel worked as a policy consultant for major companies while James was a well-known lawyer. Laurel finally arrived at the seminar location, but her frustration hadn't gone away. The hotel informed her that her room reservation had been canceled by the company the day before. With no other options, Laurel reluctantly accepted the receptionist Laura's suggestion to stay at a motel under the same group as the hotel. Since the seminar had already started, Laurel left her suitcase at the reception desk and hurried to the seminar room. Meanwhile, James turned down a lunch invitation from his female colleague. This was proof that he had changed and wasn't like before, when he used to cheat. However, Laurel was still annoyed when James sent her a message, even though it was just to ask if she had arrived safely. After the first session of the seminar ended, Laurel accidentally bumped into a man in the hotel lobby. She then called James to tell him about the canceled room reservation. She also hoped to return home on time after the seminar ended. But James brought up their weekend getaway plan again, which of course made Laurel even more annoyed. That day, Laurel decided to have lunch alone at the hotel bar because she had work to finish. She separated herself from her group and chose to focus on completing her tasks. While eating, the man she had met earlier in the lobby, named Ken, approached her and introduced himself. At first, Laurel declined Ken's invitation to have lunch together, but for some reason she eventually changed her mind and accepted the offer. They started chatting and exchanged business cards. Laurel was even intrigued by the classic watch Ken was wearing. Ken shared that the watch was an heirloom from his late father, which made Laurel even more curious about him. However, Laurel's mood suddenly shifted when she received a message from James. He told her that he had already booked accommodation at Chalet Mountains for their weekend getaway. Laurel was immediately annoyed because James made the decision without discussing it with her first. After all, they had promised Josh and Daniela a trip to Disneyland. But, as usual, James seemed more focused on their relationship than keeping promises to the kids. After finishing lunch, Laurel and Ken continued their conversation by walking around the hotel garden. Time flew by, and Laurel realized the next seminar session would start in 2 hours. When Laurel asked if Ken had missed the seminar he was supposed to attend, Ken admitted he had skipped it just to talk longer with Laurel. Ken even started flirting with Laurel and offered her small gifts, like a bag of Lay's chips. Laurel was almost swept away by Ken's charm, but she managed to remind herself that she was married. Still, Ken kept pursuing her, and eventually, Laurel began to soften. That evening, Laurel went to the motel recommended by the hotel. As a successful career woman, Laurel was clearly uncomfortable with the motel's limited, low-budget facilities. While she was getting ready, James called to discuss their vacation plans. The conversation ended up sparking another argument, making Laurel even more upset. Not long after, Ken called Laurel. He told her that she had accidentally dropped her earring when they met earlier. Ken offered to return it, even suggesting that Laurel come to his room. If she couldn't, he said he'd leave it at the reception desk. Laurel told Ken that she wasn't staying at the hotel, but at a motel she thought was awful. It turned out Ken was staying at the same motel, Laurel in room 234 and Ken in room 232. Hearing this, Ken immediately said they were destined to meet and kept persuading Laurel to come see him. Eventually, Laurel's resolve wavered, and she decided to go to Ken's room. Once there, they immediately got into a deep conversation. Laurel even admitted that this was the first time she had ever done something like this. She reasoned that her relationship with James was struggling, and she was still carrying the pain from James's past infidelity. After venting at length about her marital problems, they moved on to round 2. The next morning, Laurel hurried back to her room because she had to attend the morning seminar. While showering, she began to regret what she had done the night before. She never thought she'd betray James with someone she had just met. Laurel finally returned home. This time, she spoke more softly to James, perhaps because the guilt was still weighing on her mind. During dinner, James noticed a red mark on Laurel's neck and asked what it was. Laurel immediately lied, saying it was from a hair straightener, but deep down, she knew she was trying to cover up her big mistake. Turns out, the red mark on Laurel's neck was Ken's doing. Laurel tried to steer the conversation away by discussing the vacation plans James had booked. James explained that they really needed some alone time to work on their relationship. He also said they could leave Josh and Daniela with Angela, Laurel's sister. After all, the kids would be thrilled to have pizza with Angela. After hearing James's explanation, Laurel finally agreed to the vacation plan. While washing her face, Laurel saw the red mark on her neck again. It reminded her of Ken. She tried to push the thought away, but it was hard. The next day, James shared some bad news. He had been asked to take a few weeks off from work because of a report accusing him of ethical violations, fraud, and embezzlement. Although annoyed, Laurel tried to calm James down. She suggested he use this time off to gather evidence to defend himself. She also said this was an opportunity for them to spend more time together. That afternoon, Laurel got a call from the office receptionist. A man named Ken was trying to reach her. Ken said he couldn't stop thinking about her after their encounter the other day. He even invited her to lunch. Laurel immediately told Ken to stop contacting her. She made it clear that what happened between them was just a one-night stand and wouldn't happen again. But Ken had already come to Laurel's office, forcing her to meet him. Laurel finally met Ken and told him never to show up at her workplace again. She said their relationship was over, and he shouldn't interfere with her personal life, especially since many of her colleagues knew James, her husband. But Ken insisted that Laurel must be interested in him. Otherwise, she wouldn't have done what she did. Ken even brought up Laurel's past, like how she was active in debates during college. Laurel was shocked because Ken knew so much about her. Ken finally admitted that he had been stalking her social media and even knew about her sister, Angela. Laurel immediately told Ken to stop all of this. She said she was going back to the office because Ken had crossed the line, but Ken threatened to leak a video of them at the motel if Laurel refused to meet him again. Turns out, Ken had secretly recorded their moment. Laurel panicked and begged Ken to delete the video. She didn't want her career and marriage to fall apart because of her mistake. Laurel also said she still loved James. Eventually, Ken agreed to delete the video, but he had already made a copy of it without her knowing. Laurel grew even more fearful when she received a text from Ken asking her to call him. James, who noticed Laurel was upset, asked what was wrong. Laurel just said she forgot to buy fabric softener, trying to hide her anxiety. The weekend finally arrived. At that time, Angela had just finished shopping with Josh and Daniela. As they were about to leave the parking lot, a car suddenly sideswiped Angela's car. Turns out, it was Ken's car. Ken apologized for his carelessness and said it was an accident. He was also surprised to see Angela with 2 kids. Angela explained that they were her niece and nephew, Josh and Daniela. Ken, who seemed to want to make amends, offered to treat them to pizza as an apology. Angela, who appeared interested in Ken, accepted his offer. At the restaurant, Ken mentioned that he often looked after his niece, especially when his sister and her husband were on vacation. Angela then shared that her sister Laurel and her husband James were currently on a mountain getaway. Unknowingly, this conversation gave Ken even more insight into Laurel's life. And Laurel, who was trying to forget Ken, had no idea that her sister was casually chatting with the man who was threatening her life. When Angela mentioned that Laurel and James were vacationing in the mountains, Ken pretended to ask where exactly they were staying. Turns out, Ken's intention in getting close to Angela was to find out Laurel's whereabouts. As soon as Angela told him, Ken immediately headed to that location. He even arrived there before Laurel and James did. When Laurel and James arrived at the resort, Laurel could hardly believe her eyes. She saw someone who looked exactly like Ken. But, unsure, she chose not to say anything to James. Laurel decided to go to the spa because she felt sore after the trip. However, while getting a massage, Laurel kept imagining Ken's touch. She even fantasized that it was Ken massaging her. Realizing her thoughts were drifting in the wrong direction, Laurel immediately asked the therapist to stop. Not long after, James came looking for Laurel because he couldn't find her at the spa. Laurel said she wasn't in the mood for a massage. James grew suspicious and asked what was really going on, especially since Laurel usually enjoyed massages. Finally, Laurel took James back to their room and told him everything that had happened between her and Ken. She admitted that she had cheated because she was going through a lot, and Ken had come at the right time, acting like an escape. James was clearly angry hearing Laurel's confession, but he also realized this might be a consequence of his own past mistakes. James asked if Laurel had done this to get back at him for his affair in the past. Laurel immediately denied it. She said it wasn't about revenge, but more about her being vulnerable, and Ken taking advantage of the situation. Laurel even shared details of their forbidden relationship, perhaps out of guilt and a desire to be honest with James. James, uncomfortable hearing the details, asked Laurel to stop talking. He then went out to get some ice, but on the way, someone suddenly pushed James down the stairs. Luckily, James wasn't seriously hurt and got help right away. James said someone had intentionally pushed him, but he didn't see who it was. He was confused because it was unlikely that a resort staff member would do something like that. Laurel finally told James that she had seen someone who looked like Ken earlier, but unsure, she had chosen not to say anything. Shortly after, the police arrived to investigate the incident after James reported being pushed. However, James suddenly changed his mind and withdrew the report. He said he wasn't sure what had happened and didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Laurel was left confused by James's decision. James explained his reasoning. If it turned out Ken was the one who pushed him, the case could leak to the media. That would ruin both of their reputations and careers. Who would want to hire a lawyer like James if it got out that he had cheated? The same went for Laurel. Who would want to hire a consultant involved in a betrayal scandal? Eventually, they decided to just go home and try to forget all of this. When they got home, Laurel was shocked to find a rose and a poem on their bed. After reading the poem, James felt familiar with the writing style. He immediately dug through his old client archives. Turns out, James had once handled a domestic violence case where the husband would always apologize by writing poems and giving flowers to his wife after each act of abuse. The poem Laurel received was exactly like the ones written by James's former client, and, as it turned out, that client's husband was Ken. James finally realized that all of this was part of Ken's revenge. Ken had deliberately gotten close to Laurel and done all of this to get back at James for winning the divorce case he had handled. James then contacted his friend Ari, a private detective and former police officer, to help investigate the case further. Ari came to meet Laurel to get her statement. Laurel told him everything, including the recording Ken had. Even though Ken claimed he had deleted the video, Ari was certain Ken still had a copy. Ari suggested Laurel and James install alarms and CCTV cameras immediately. According to him, someone like Ken wouldn't stop until his target, Laurel, was achieved. Ari also asked them to be patient while he gathered evidence. He promised to find proof that Ken had been stalking Laurel so they could press charges. After talking with Ari, Laurel had to go to the office to pick up some documents. James was worried and wanted to go with her, afraid Ken might attack Laurel, but Laurel was confident she'd be safe and decided to go alone. Unfortunately, James's fears came true. As Laurel was about to leave the office, Ken suddenly appeared and followed her into the elevator. Luckily, Laurel managed to escape. Meanwhile, Josh and Daniela had already come home. Laurel told Angela about the man who was stalking her. Laurel and James asked Angela to take Josh and Daniela on a week-long vacation to California. They were worried Ken might come to the house. Plus, they wanted to focus on helping Ari investigate the case. Angela agreed and went home because she had a date that night. She would pick up Josh and Daniela the next day. Night fell. Well, you guys probably guessed who the guy Angela was going on a date with. Yep, that's right, it was Ken. As usual, Angela told Ken everything about her personal life. Even though they just met, Angela didn't seem to think that Ken could be a bad guy. Ken invited Angela to a concert on Friday, but Angela said she couldn't because she had to take Josh and Daniela out. Ken asked if there was a problem. Innocently, Angela told him that there was a stalker after her sister, and they had already hired a private detective to investigate the guy. As a result, Ken knew all their plans. The next day, Ken sent a man to James's house. The man pretended to deliver a package. When James answered the door, the guy grabbed his hand and slammed his own nose into the car hood. Then, the guy called the police to report James for assault. He kept provoking James, saying that James couldn't control his temper. Since James reacted aggressively, the police ended up arresting him. Not long after, Ari called Laurel and asked them to come to his office. But after finding out that James had just been arrested, Ari said he would come to their house instead. When he arrived, Ari told them that Ken's real name was actually Ray Peterson. When Ken was 12 years old, he beat up his mom and stabbed his own dad to death. This was proof that Ken was a very dangerous person. Ari and his team also managed to find evidence that Ken was the one who changed Laurel's hotel reservation. Ken was also the one who instructed the receptionist to recommend that motel to Laurel. That meant, from the start, nothing was a coincidence. Everything had been planned by Ken. Ari also found CCTV footage showing Ken's presence at the resort. Even though there was no footage showing Ken pushing James, Ari was absolutely sure Ken was the culprit. After that incident, Laurel immediately called Angela, who had just finished hanging out with Ken. Laurel asked Angela to go pick up Josh and Daniela right away. As soon as they left, Laurel went back home because she forgot her car keys. Unfortunately, she couldn't find her keys anywhere. Suddenly, Ken appeared and told Laurel to get in the car because he wanted to take her somewhere. Luckily, a neighbor saw what was happening and called the police right away. Meanwhile, Ari met with a cop named Jimmy to ask them to release James. Ari said his client was being framed and showed all the evidence to support his claim. Even though Ari and Jimmy had been friends since Ari was a cop, Jimmy couldn't help much. But, not long after, Jimmy got a call from his team reporting Angela's kidnapping. Finally, Jimmy agreed to release James, with Ari as the guarantor. While Jimmy was busy with other things, Ari quickly took James away from there. Ari didn't want the police to know about Ken's whereabouts because they would definitely come with a big squad. If that happened, Ken would have already escaped. Ari had managed to track Ken's location, thanks to the number on the business card Ken gave Laurel. It turned out Ken took Laurel to a cabin in the middle of the woods. According to Ken, the cabin was a family inheritance. His wife didn't want the cabin back then because it was useless. Ken brought Laurel to the cabin because he actually intended to kill her. Laurel immediately begged Ken not to do it. She said she still had 2 kids and still loved her husband. But Ken didn't budge. Ken was angry because James made him go broke, and Laurel had also rejected him. Ken even predicted that James would come to the cabin with Ari. Because of that, Ken planned to kill both of them there. After James and Ari were dead, Ken planned to marry Laurel and raise her kids. Laurel, knowing that Ken had threatened her sister Angela, became furious. Luckily, Laurel got a chance to hit Ken. At the same time, James and Ari had found Angela's car. Ari told James to call the police and ask them to come to the location, while Ari went ahead to find Laurel. Soon, Ari found Laurel trying to escape. Unfortunately, Laurel got caught again, while Ari was injured by Ken's gunfire. Shortly after, James handed his phone to Ari to call 911, while James hurried to find Laurel. Luckily, James arrived just in time before Ken could shoot Laurel. During the struggle, Laurel managed to break free and ended Ken with a single shot. After that, as we could all predict, James and Laurel finally got back together as a happy couple.